So the first of his 3 points is about controlling the tongue. And he says that if we can't do this, our religion is worthless because we're not bridling our tongue and we're deceiving our hearts. He's picking up on the words of the scriptures of the Psalms, where the psalmist prays in Psalm 19, verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer." And of course, the tongue is such a powerful organ of communication. And if our tongues, what we say, and our hearts, what we think and feel, and our passions are out of sync or out of order, this of course leads to terrible damage because the things we say harm others. And so the question is, how do we control our tongues? James is going to go on in later chapters to give a lot more detail about this, but the point he makes here is that we should not deceive our hearts. And if our tongues, the things that we say, are deceiving our inner heart attitudes and thoughts and feelings, we're allowing our hearts to deceive us as well. And we speak and do not do the things that we say. We say the wrong things and do not realize it. We argue and lose friends. This was a problem particularly for James in his audience. A lot of arguments were going on in the church. The answer is not to be silent, although that's often a help, because even a fool seems wise if he opens not his mouth, but rather to have a self-awareness of what we are thinking and feeling before we put it into words. So we have to control our tongues. The second point that James is going to make is that just as God is a father to the fatherless and the protector of widows, so we too must look after the widows and the orphans. Now, we are all orphans until we are adopted into the family of God. And we are to be fathers and mothers to those who do not have parents. And God himself in the Bible is seen as the husband of his people Israel and of the church. So to look after widows and orphans for James is simply reflecting the character and the activity of God, that he looks after us. He puts us in families. He makes us belong. What did it mean then to visit orphans and widows in their affliction? Well, the widows and the orphans were those who had been bereaved. So they were grieving. And not only were they grieving for the personal loss, but they had lost their identity as members of families and communities. And they had lost their connection. There was nobody to protect them and look after them. They were without power. And as so often, they were isolated and lonely and vulnerable. And so they had to rely on the welfare of others. The widows and orphans in James's day were particularly needing emotional, spiritual, practical, and financial support. You can see the graphic there. The widow and the orphan in printing is where there's a piece that is completely disengaged from the rest of the paragraph. And we need to ask ourselves as Christians, as disciples of Jesus today, who are today's widows and orphans? Of course, we should start with those who are widows and orphans, those who've lost their loved ones. But of course, there are so many people on the margins of our society, the homeless, the asylum seekers, the people who have got emotional needs, the people who've got psychological needs, who've got physical needs, the people who are confused in themselves, who are really isolated and vulnerable today. And we need to visit them. Now, visiting somebody is not just, hello, have a nice cup of tea. Visiting somebody meant looking after them. The word in the Greek is the same word for a bishop, episkopos, somebody who looks over the needs of somebody else. And if you visited somebody, you didn't just greet them and have a nice cup of tea. You actually made sure that their needs were being met. You provided food, shelter, clothing, lodging, purpose. So that's what James means by visiting orphans and widows in their distress, in their affliction. And the third point that James makes in this short 2-verse, amazingly concise sermon is to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, I don't know if you know much about scholastic partial differential equations. I didn't know anything until last week when it was announced on the BBC local news that Professor Sir Martin Hare, the winner of the 2021 Breakthrough Prize in Mathematics, had won this prize for his work on what he calls stochastic partial differential equations. Professor Hare's work focuses on generating equations to accurately describe seemingly random motion in time and space, such as how droplets of wine spread across the surface of a napkin or the growth of a bacteria on a Petri dish. And he tries to put a model together of what does it mean to be a solution to these problems. Now, if like me, you're enjoying this service from your home, you might have your cup of coffee or cup of tea with you. I've got mine here. And if I stain it, or if my paper towel goes in and a stain develops on the serviette, there is no way of calculating, according to Professor Hare, how that stain will spread. And yet for you and me, the stain that James is talking about here is the stain of sin, of falling short of God's standards. The word sin, take away the letter S, take away the letter N, and what do you have left? You have I. And while we are told to keep ourselves from being stained by the world, certainly if you're like me, you know that there are many things that can stain you inwardly and take away your holy position of living rightly with God. Here's the DIY case to stain, the DIY guide to stain removal. It might be tomato sauce, it might be red wine, it might be sweat or deodorant, it might be ink, it might be coffee, it might be grass, whatever it is. These things, if they stain us, or if they stain our t-shirt, we have to find the antidote to remove the stain. And James is saying that we need to keep ourselves from being stained by the world. This is a daily occurrence of coming to God and asking his forgiveness and repenting of the things that we know have not been right in what we think, in what we feel, in what we do, in what we say. Not only should we repent of those things, but we then should receive forgiveness. And I'm so glad that Jesus died on the cross to forgive me. And he rose again from the dead to set me free. And many Christians know that they should feel forgiven, but they actually feel guilty and still are bound up by many things that stain them. We need to receive that forgiveness and then be reconciled with God and with others, especially if we've offended them or said the wrong things. And then we need to rejoice. And my advice is to then find strategies to overcome and avoid temptation the next time. James says we have to keep ourselves. It's not a once and for all event. We have to keep on keeping on at asking God's forgiveness, repenting of our sin, being reconciled to God and others, moving into rejoicing, and then avoiding the same problem if we can. So as I come to conclude, we need to really do three things. We need to walk the walk. In other words, to live a way where we're looking after the needy. We need to talk the talk. We need to control what we say and be very careful about the use of our tongues. And we need to avoid the mess. I couldn't think of a rhyming slang for this. We need to avoid the stain of the world by keeping our distance from it. The psalmist, well, I'll come back to him in a moment. If you think of the NHS slogan, the government slogan right now, we need with our hands to do the right things. And our hands are the part of us that are practical, that help others and help the needs of others. We need to keep washing those. We need to cover our face so that the words that come out of our mouth do not damage others. And we need to keep space, not social distance, but spiritual distance from the stain of the world. The psalmist said this, "Who may ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation." Clean hands means doing the right thing with your hands. A pure heart, having the right motives and emotions. Not swearing deceitfully, not being a false witness, not saying the wrong things. And if we do that, if we are keeping our deeds of serving the poor, the widows and the orphans, covering our face, watching out for the things that come out from our mouths, and keeping our distance, not just from each other, but keeping our distance from sin and the world and the flesh and the devil, then we will fulfill this teaching from James. Thank you so much for sharing with me and listening, and may God bless you this Sunday, and may you walk the talk, walk the walk, talk the talk, and avoid the mess. Thank you.